My grandfather looked me in the eye on Christmas Eve, handed me a check for $10 million, and told me I was the only one in the room he trusted with it. By the time the plates were cleared, my father had torn his copy in half and called the whole thing a senile old man's delusion. My aunt laughed so hard she spilled her wine. My uncle folded his into a paper airplane and sailed it across the table. My cousin posted a video mocking it before she even left the driveway. I was the only one who said thank you. I was the only one who folded mine carefully, slid it into the inside pocket of my coat, and drove home through the snow with both hands on the wheel and something heavy and quiet sitting in my chest that I could not yet name. The next morning, before I had even finished my coffee, my phone rang. It was the branch manager of First Harbor Bank in Traverse City. His voice was careful and professional, and he asked me if I could come in at my earliest convenience. He said he needed to discuss something important regarding my grandfather's account. I said I would be there in 20 minutes. Before I tell you what he said, I want to ask you something. If you have ever been the one in your family who showed up, not because anyone asked you to, not because there was anything in it for you, but just because it was the right thing to do, this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button and stay with me, because what happened next is something I am still processing 2 years later, and I think you're going to want to hear every single word of it. My grandfather's name was Gerald Castleton. He was 79 years old, and he had lived in the same house on Lighthouse Ridge Road in Traverse City, Michigan for 51 years. The house sat back from the road behind 2 white birch trees he had planted the year my grandmother was pregnant with my father, and in the winter the branches caught the snow in a way that made the whole front yard look like something off a postcard that nobody actually sends anymore. He had a workshop in the back where he repaired clocks. Not as a business. Just because he liked the way things with broken insides could be made whole again if you were patient enough and paid close enough attention. I started visiting him on Sunday afternoons when I was 24. I had just moved back to Traverse City after 2 years in Chicago trying to make a career in graphic design work in a city that had more graphic designers than it had coffee shops, which in Chicago is saying something. I came back with a portfolio, a sublease on a 1-bedroom apartment on Front Street, and the particular kind of exhaustion that only comes from spending 2 years pretending you are doing fine. My grandfather was the first person who did not ask me how Chicago went. He handed me a cup of coffee, pointed at the stool beside his workbench and said, "Hand me that 3rd screwdriver, the one with the yellow handle." So I did. And that was how it started. Every Sunday I would drive out to Lighthouse Ridge Road in my old Civic with the heat that only worked on the passenger side, and I would sit in that workshop while he repaired whatever clock someone had dropped off that week. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we didn't. He had a radio on the shelf above the workbench that only picked up 2 stations clearly, one that played old country and one that played weather reports, and he alternated between them with a complete lack of preference that I always found quietly hilarious. He never once asked me if I was dating anyone. He never once suggested I should be doing something more stable. He asked me what I was working on, and he looked at whatever I showed him with the full attention of a man who understood that the work itself was the point. My father, Clifford Castleton, had a different relationship with grandfather Gerald. My father was 54 years old, and he had spent the better part of 3 decades being quietly resentful of a man he believed had never given him enough credit. Clifford ran a mid-size hardware distribution company out of a warehouse on the south end of town, and he had built it himself, which he mentioned at every family gathering with the consistency of a man who needed the room to confirm something he was not entirely sure of himself. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had decided somewhere along the way that love was a transaction, and he had never quite reconciled the fact that his father did not seem to be keeping the same ledger. My Aunt Renata was my father's younger sister. She lived in a newer development outside of town in a house with a 3-car garage and a kitchen that had been featured in a local home magazine 2 years before, a fact she found ways to mention with impressive frequency. Renata had 2 moods, performing warmth and performing injury, and she moved between them with the fluid ease of someone who had practiced both since childhood. She had never once visited my grandfather on her own. She came to holidays, and she came when there was news worth knowing, and those 2 things were, in her world, essentially the same event. My Uncle Doug was Renata's husband, a man so thoroughly agreeable in public and so thoroughly absent in private that I had spent years genuinely forgetting he had opinions. He laughed when Renata laughed. He frowned when Renata frowned. At Christmas dinner he had sailed that check across the table and grinned like a boy who had gotten away with something, and then he looked at Renata to confirm that he had. My cousin Brittany was Renata and Doug's daughter, 26 years old, With a social media following she treated like a second income and a talent for turning other people's pain into content she could monetize. She had filmed my grandfather's hands shaking slightly when he handed out the envelopes and posted a clip of it with a caption that said, "When Grandpa goes full Willy Wonka at Christmas dinner," and 3 laughing emojis. It had 400 likes by midnight. She deleted it 4 days later, but I had already seen it. I do not think she deleted it because she felt bad. I think she deleted it because the comments had started to turn. The Christmas dinner where it all happened was Gerald Castleton's idea from the beginning. He called me in early December on a Sunday evening when I happened to be at his house already, sitting at the kitchen table with a bowl of the chicken soup he made every winter from a recipe his own mother had written on an index card in 1967. He set his coffee down and looked at me with the particular expression I had come to recognize over 5 years of Sundays, the expression that meant he had something to say and he was going to say it in his own time and in his own way, and my job was to be still enough to hear it. He told me he had been to see his doctor in November. He told me the news was not good. He said the word emphysema the way he said most difficult things, quietly and without ceremony, the way you state a fact that does not become less true by being dramatized. He was not on oxygen yet, but the doctor had been clear that the trajectory was not reversible and that he should begin thinking seriously about what the next chapter looked like. He told me he had already spoken to his attorney. He told me he had been planning this Christmas for a while. I asked him if anyone else knew. He shook his head. He said he wanted one more Christmas that felt like Christmas, not like a vigil. He said he had a few things he needed to give out and he wanted to do it in person at the table the way his own grandfather had done things. He looked at me over his coffee cup and said, "I already know what you're going to do with yours, Luna. That's why I'm telling you ahead of time. So you're not blindsided." I asked him how he could possibly know what I was going to do with it. He smiled and said, "Because I know you. And because you're the only one of them who ever asked me about the clocks." I did not sleep well that night. I drove home through the dark with the heater blowing warm air on the passenger side and cold air on mine, and I thought about what it meant that a man who had lived 79 years and built something real and quiet and entirely his own had looked around his family table and decided that only one person at it had earned his trust. I did not feel proud. I felt the specific weight of being seen by someone who you know is running out of time to keep seeing you. Christmas Eve came cold and clear, the way the best December nights in Traverse City come, with the kind of sky that makes the lake look like it's made of dark glass and the whole world feel temporarily honest. I brought a jar of cherry preserves from the farm stand on M72 that I knew he liked. He met me at the door in his green flannel shirt, the one with the frayed left cuff he had been meaning to mend for 2 years. He squeezed my shoulder and said, "You're early." I said, "I'm always early." He said, "I know. That's one of the things." They arrived one by one after that. My father's truck in the driveway. Renata's SUV. Doug already reaching for his phone before he was through the door. Brittany filming the birch trees in the front yard for her stories. And my grandfather standing in his kitchen, calm and unhurried, with a small cedar box sitting on the counter beside the soup pot, and an expression on his face that I would not fully understand until the following morning when a bank manager named Paul Eddington closed his office door, sat down across from me, and said 4 words I will never forget for the rest of my life. The cedar box had a latch on it that my grandfather had repaired himself 3 Christmases ago. I remembered watching him do it at his workbench on a Sunday in November, pressing the small brass fitting back into place with the tip of a flathead screwdriver and a patience that most people reserve for things worth considerably more than a decorative box. I had asked him what was in it. He had said, "Nothing yet." I had not thought about that answer until I watched him lift the lid at the dinner table on Christmas Eve and pull out 5 envelopes, each one cream-colored, each one sealed, each one with a name written on the front in his careful, unhurried handwriting. He did not make a speech. That was the first thing that struck me. My grandfather was not a speech-making man. He stood at the head of the table with one hand resting on the back of his chair and he said simply that he had something he wanted each of them to have, and that he hoped they would receive it in the spirit it was given. Then he walked the envelopes around the table one by one and set each one down beside the person it was meant for. When he got to me he held mine a half-second longer than the others before he let it go. I did not look up at him. I looked at the envelope. My name on the front. Just that. No last name. Like he was writing to someone he did not need to explain. My father opened his first. Of course he did. Clifford Castleton had been opening things first his entire life. Doors, conversations, bottles of wine that were not his to open. He pulled the check out and looked at it with the expression of a man reading a document in a language he was fairly confident was nonsense. Then his jaw set. Then he put the check face down on the table and said, "Dad, what is this?" It was not a question. It had the flat, declarative weight of a man who had already decided on his answer and was waiting for the room to agree with him. My grandfather sat back down. He picked up his fork. He said, "It's what it looks like, Cliff." Renata had her envelope open by then. She held the check up to the light the way you hold up a bill you suspect is counterfeit, which told you everything you needed to know about the way Renata moved through the world. She laughed once, a short sharp sound, and looked at my father. "Rich, this says $10 million. She said it the way you say a punchline. Doug leaned over to read it and made a sound in his throat that was somewhere between impressed and deeply uncomfortable. Brittany had her phone out already. I saw her angle it toward my grandfather's hands. I looked away. My father pushed his chair back from the table. Not all the way. Just enough to signal that he was a man making a decision. "I'm not going to insult you by pretending this is real," he said. "But I'm also not going to sit here and play along with it. You need to talk to Dr. Marsh again, Dad. I've been saying this for months." My grandfather did not look up from his plate. He said, "I talked to Dr. Marsh in November. He sends his regards." That was when my father picked up the check and tore it in half. He did it cleanly, down the middle, the way you tear something you have decided has no value. He set both halves beside his bread plate with a kind of finality that was almost theatrical. My mother, who had said nothing since the envelopes came out, looked at the two pieces and then looked at her own envelope, still sealed, still sitting beside her water glass. She opened hers. She read it. She folded it back in half and put it in her purse without a word. I still do not entirely know what to make of that. I have turned it over many times. Renata went next. She did not tear hers. She slid it across the table toward my grandfather with 2 fingers, the way you return something at a store when you've decided it's not what you wanted. "Gerald," she said, and she only ever called him Gerald when she was performing disappointment. "This is not funny and it is not kind. You're confusing people." My grandfather looked at her for a long moment and said, "I'm not confused, Renata. I haven't been confused a day in my life." She pulled her hand back. She reached for her wine. Doug's contribution was the paper airplane. He had folded it with 3 quick creases, the practiced fold of a man who had been making paper airplanes since grade school, and he sailed it down the table toward the fruit bowl with a grin that collapsed the moment it left his fingers, and he registered that nobody in the room was laughing the way he had expected. The check caught the edge of the bowl and fell to the floor beside the table leg. Nobody picked it up. I looked at it lying there, face up on the hardwood, $10 million printed in my grandfather's ink, and I thought about the Sunday 2 months earlier when he had asked me what I thought I would do with my life if money were not the obstacle. I had said I would probably keep doing exactly what I was doing, freelance design work, just with better equipment and less panic. He had nodded slowly and said, "That sounds about right for you." Brittany did not make a speech either. She stood up, walked to the kitchen trash can beside the sink, and dropped her envelope in without opening it. Then she came back to the table and said, "Sorry, Grandpa, but I'm not going to be part of whatever this is." She picked up her phone and resumed whatever she had been doing before the envelopes came out. I remember noticing that detail. The specific ordinariness of the container into which my cousin had just thrown $10 million. My grandfather watched all of it. He watched my father tear his check. He watched Renata slide hers back. He watched Doug's paper airplane. He watched Brittany at the trash can. He watched my mother put hers in her purse without comment. And through all of it his face held the same expression, not hurt, not angry, not even particularly surprised. He looked like a man watching a weather system he had predicted roll in exactly on schedule. When it was done he looked at me. I had not opened my envelope yet. I was holding it in both hands under the table. "You going to open yours?" he said. I opened it. I took the check out. I read it. The amount was written in his handwriting, the same careful slanted hand that had labeled every clock in his workshop with a small white tag describing the repair needed. $10 million. Made out to Luna Castleton. The ink was blue and unhurried. I turned it over. On the back, in smaller letters, he had written one sentence. "For the one who never needed a reason to show up." I folded it in half once. I put it in the inside pocket of my coat, which was hanging on the back of my chair. I looked at my grandfather and I said, "Thank you, Grandpa." He nodded once. The way he nodded when a clock came back together the way it was supposed to. My father made one more attempt before the night was over. He waited until the dishes were being cleared, until Renata had moved into the living room and Doug had found the football game on the television in the den, and he cornered my grandfather in the kitchen doorway with the low measured voice he used when he wanted to sound reasonable while being anything but. I heard him say that there were legal implications to this kind of thing, that if someone at the bank had let a man in Gerald's condition authorize a transaction of this size there would be questions worth asking. My grandfather listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then he said, "Cliff, I authorized those checks in October." Paul Eddington was sitting 4 feet away from me. I was wearing my good shirt. My father said, "That's not the point." My grandfather said, "Then I'm not sure what the point is." And he walked back to the sink and finished washing the pot he had been washing before my father stopped him. I left before 10. I hugged my grandfather at the door and he held on for a second longer than usual. He smelled like wood smoke and the cherry pipe tobacco he kept on the mantel but never actually smoked, just kept there because my grandmother had bought it for him in 1987 and he had never thrown it out. He said, "Drive careful. The M72 gets icy past the turnoff." I said I would. I said I would see him Sunday. He said, "I know you will." I drove home with the radio off. The lake was invisible in the dark but I knew it was there the way you always know it in Traverse City. That specific pressure on the left side of the air when driving north, like the whole city leans slightly toward the water. I did not take the check out of my coat pocket again that night. I did not need to. I knew what it said. What I did not know, what I could not have known sitting in that car in the dark listening to my own breathing, was what the check represented beyond its face value. I did not know about the 40 years of decisions my grandfather had made in private, the accounts, the investments, the slow and deliberate accumulation of a man who had never once mentioned any of it at a family dinner. I did not know about the folder in Paul Eddington's office or the letter from the attorney, or what would come to light the week after Christmas when a single phone call would change everything I thought I understood about Gerald Castleton and the quiet life he had built on Lighthouse Ridge Road, in a house with 2 birch trees and a workshop full of broken things he had spent 50 years learning how to fix. Paul Eddington had worked at First Harbor Bank for 22 years. He was the kind of man who remembered faces and used your name when he greeted you, not in the performative way of someone trained to do it, but in the way of a person who had decided that names mattered and that saying them cost nothing. He had a photograph on his desk of a black Labrador sitting in a canoe, looking entirely unbothered by the water. His voice on the phone the morning after Christmas was not the voice of a man making a routine call. It was careful, measured. The voice of someone who has rehearsed the opening of a conversation and is now in it. He said good morning. He said he was sorry to call so early. He said he wanted to make sure I could come in at my convenience, though if I was available that morning that would be ideal. I told him I could be there in 20 minutes. He said that would be fine. He said to ask for him directly at the front desk. I drove to the bank in yesterday's coat, the one with the check still in the inside pocket. I had not moved it. It had felt overnight like something I should not disturb until I understood what it was, the way you leave a bird on a windowsill until you know if it is resting or injured. The morning was gray and cold, the lake somewhere behind the cloud cover doing whatever the lake does in late December when nobody is watching it. I found a parking spot on Union Street and sat in the car for a moment with my hands on the wheel and then went inside. Paul Eddington met me in the lobby. He shook my hand with both of his, which I noted. He walked me past the teller windows and the blinking Christmas tree on the counter, down a short hallway, and into a private office with a round table and no windows. He closed the door. He sat across from me. He folded his hands on the table and looked at me with the expression of a man who is about to say something he has been authorized to say and is choosing his entry point carefully. I put the check on the table between us before he could begin. He looked at it. He looked at me. He said, "You kept it." I said, "I didn't know what else to do with it." He nodded slowly. He picked it up with both hands and looked at it the way my grandfather looked at a movement he was diagnosing, not casually but with a specific attending focus. Then he set it back down and said, "Luna, your grandfather came into this branch on the 14th of October. He sat in this room. I was here. Our notary was here. He had his attorney on the phone. These checks were drafted, verified, and authorized over the course of 2 hours. I watched him sign every one of them. He paused. This check is as real as the table between us. I had known, somewhere beneath the uncertainty, that it was real. My grandfather did not do things without intention. He did not say things he did not mean. But hearing Paul Eddington say it in a room with no windows in the flat declarative language of a man who had been doing this for 22 years was a different thing entirely. It settled in my chest with a weight that was not exactly joy and not exactly grief, and was mostly just the feeling of something enormous becoming true. Paul said there was more. He said that was actually the primary reason he had called. He told me that my grandfather had set up a separate account in October, distinct from his existing accounts, and that this account had a designated beneficiary instruction attached to it that would transfer its full contents to me upon his death, bypassing probate entirely. He told me the current balance of that account. I will not repeat the number here. What I will say is that it was significantly larger than $10 million, and that when Paul said it, I looked at the photograph of the dog in the canoe and focused on the dog's expression until the room stopped tilting. I asked Paul how long my grandfather had had money like this. Paul said that to his knowledge, and he had been managing Gerald Castleton's accounts for 11 years, the assets had been accumulating for at least 3 decades. He said my grandfather had been an exceptionally disciplined investor, that his decisions in the early 90s had compounded quietly and consistently for 30 years. He said Gerald had never taken on debt he did not intend to eliminate within 18 months. He said he had never once in 11 years seen him make an impulsive financial decision. He said, and this was the part one kept returning to afterward, that my grandfather had told him in October that he was not giving his family money. He was giving them a chance to show him who they were. And he already knew who most of them were. He just wanted it on record. I drove directly from the bank to Lighthouse Ridge Road. My grandfather was in the workshop when I pulled up. He came to the door when he heard my car, holding a clock movement in one hand and a pair of needle nose pliers in the other, and he looked at my face and set both things down on the bench behind him. He said, "Paul called you." I said, "Paul called me." He said, "Come in then. It's cold." We sat at the kitchen table with the coffee he already had going, and he told me things he had not told anyone in his family in 30 years of Sunday dinners and Christmas Eves and birthday calls that lasted 4 minutes because nobody on the other end had questions worth asking. He told me about 2 parcels outside Traverse City he had bought in 1991 when the market was soft and held when everyone around him was selling. He told me about the industrial lots near Grand Rapids, a decision made after reading a single report in a trade magazine he had followed since 1988. He told me about the advisor he had found through a letter to that magazine's editor, a woman named Carolyn Feist who ran a small firm in Lansing and who had never once told him what he wanted to hear, only what the numbers said. He told me that my father had asked him once in the late 90s if he needed help managing his finances. He said Clifford had sat at this same kitchen table with a legal pad and the particular expression he wore when appearing helpful while angling for access, and that Gerald had looked at him and said he had it handled. He said Clifford had not asked again. He said that was the answer he had been looking for. I asked him why he had never told me any of this. He was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup on the table the way he turned a clock case to check its level. He said, because it wasn't what we were doing on Sundays. He said it simply without drama, and I understood exactly what he meant. What we were doing on Sundays had nothing to do with money. It had to do with the radio picking up 2 stations and the right screwdriver and sitting with a person who was not performing anything and not asking you to perform anything back. Money would have changed the shape of that. He had not wanted it changed. Then he told me about the attorney. His name was Victor Lund, my grandfather's attorney since 1996, who had drawn up the will, updated it twice, and prepared the beneficiary designations Paul had described that morning. My grandfather told me the will would be read after he was gone, and that I would hear from Victor when the time came, and that there were some specifics he wanted me to know ahead of time so I was not walking into that room unprepared. He told me the house was in the will. He told me the workshop and everything in it was in the will. He told me there was a letter attached to the will, one he had written himself, that explained his reasoning in his own words, and that this letter had been notarized and witnessed and was, in Victor Lund's words, legally airtight. I asked him if he expected the family to contest it. He picked up his coffee. He looked at me over the rim of the cup with the dry, unhurried expression of a man who had been reading people for 79 years. He said, "Cliff will contest it before the ink is dry. That's all right. Victor has been expecting it since 2019. I asked what happened in 2019. He said, "Your father asked to be added to my primary account." I said no. He did not take it well. He paused. I had Victor update the documents the following week. Just to be sure. The phone calls started that afternoon. My father first, then Renata, then a number I did not recognize that turned out to be Doug calling from Renata's work phone. The tone had changed entirely from the night before. The checks that had been theatrical nonsense at the dinner table were now, apparently, a serious matter the family needed to discuss together as a unit and sort out fairly. My father left a voicemail that used the word fair 4 times in 90 seconds, which was notable because I had never once heard him use it in a context that did not mean something favorable to himself. Renata sent a text that said simply, "Lunch? Just us girls. Tuesday." I read it twice. I put my phone face down on the counter and looked out the window at the birch trees, bare and white against the gray December sky. My grandfather had walked me to my car that morning and looked at the sky the way he always did, like he was reading something most people did not know how to find. He said, "Luna, when people show you what they value, believe them the first time. They already showed you last night." I drove home. I did not return a single call. My grandfather's emphysema moved faster than the doctor had predicted. By the middle of January he was on supplemental oxygen at night, and by the first week of February he had agreed, after a conversation I did not push him toward but was present for, to have a home health aide come in 3 mornings a week. Her name was Darlene, a no-nonsense woman from Elk Rapids who had been doing this work for 18 years and who within 4 days had learned exactly how he took his coffee and how much conversation he wanted before 9 in the morning, which was none. They got along very well. I was at the house most afternoons. I had restructured my freelance work to be mostly remote and mostly asynchronous, which was not difficult because it had always been mostly remote and mostly asynchronous. I sat in the kitchen and worked on my laptop while he read in the chair by the front window, the one with the view of the birch trees, and sometimes we talked and sometimes we didn't, and it was the same as Sundays had always been except that the oxygen concentrator in the corner of the room made a low rhythmic sound that I had to learn not to hear. I learned not to hear it. I got very good at not hearing it. He was still going into the workshop some afternoons. Not for long stretches. An hour, sometimes less. Darlene had asked me privately whether I thought we should discourage it. I said no. I said the workshop was where he thought, and that stopping him from thinking was not something either of us was equipped to defend. She had looked at me for a moment and then nodded and said, "Fair enough." He finished 3 clocks in January. He left notes inside each one describing the repair, the date, and the original defect. He had been doing this for 40 years. Hundreds of clocks, hundreds of notes. A private archive of restored things that nobody had ever asked to see. The family did not come. This is the part one want to be precise about because I have told this story to people who assume I must be exaggerating, that surely someone visited, that surely the situation prompted some version of decency from at least one of them. My father came once in January. He stayed 40 minutes. He spent most of it standing in the kitchen doorway with his coat still on, asking questions about the will that my grandfather answered in the same even tone he used to describe the weather. My father left without saying goodbye to me. I was sitting 8 feet away at the kitchen table. He walked past me and out the door and I watched his truck back out of the driveway and disappear down Lighthouse Ridge Road, and I sat with that for a long time. Renata did not come at all. She sent a poinsettia in early January with a card that said, "Thinking of you," in the generic script of a card that had been written by no one in particular. My grandfather looked at the poinsettia for a moment when Darlene set it on the counter and said it was a nice enough plant and asked her to put it in the window where it would get light. He did not mention Renata again. Doug sent a text to my phone, not to my grandfather's phone, asking how Gerald was doing. I replied that he was managing. Doug sent a thumbs up. That was the full extent of Doug's participation in the final chapter of his wife's father's life. Brittany had gone quiet on her social media in the weeks after Christmas, which I noticed only because a mutual acquaintance mentioned it at the grocery store with the slightly breathless energy of someone delivering news they find interesting. Apparently Brittany had posted something vague about family stress and boundaries and the particular exhaustion of being a feeling person in an unfeeling world, and her followers had been supportive in the way followers are supportive, which is to say loudly and without any actual information. She had not contacted me. She had not contacted my grandfather. She had, as far as I could tell, processed the entire situation as content and moved on. My grandfather asked me one afternoon in late January to bring him the small tin box he kept on the second shelf of the bookcase in the hallway. I brought it. He opened it at the kitchen table and took out a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a hand-drawn map of the workshop, each bench and shelf labeled in his small, careful print, with notations indicating where specific tools were kept and which projects were in progress and what condition each one was in. He handed it to me and said, "When the time comes, give this to Victor. He'll know what to do with the inventory." I took the map. I held it for a moment. I said, "Okay." He said, "Don't make a thing of it." So I didn't. Victor Lund called me the last week of January. He was a deliberate man on the phone, careful with pauses the way careful people are, letting silence do the work that lesser attorneys fill with noise. He told me he wanted me to be aware that the will, as currently drafted, was structured to minimize the window for a successful contest. He said my grandfather had been proactive about this in ways that went beyond the standard precautions. He said there were 3 signed capacity evaluations on file, performed by my grandfather's physician at Gerald's own request, the most recent of which had been completed in November. He said there was a recorded statement, also from November, in which my grandfather spoke for 22 minutes in his own voice about his intentions, his reasoning, and the specific history of his relationships with each named and excluded party. Victor said he had listened to it twice. He said it was, in his 30 years of estate work, the most thorough and self-possessed document of intent he had ever encountered. He said my grandfather had prepared it the way my grandfather prepared everything, with patience and without a single wasted word. I asked Victor if he thought the family would actually go through with contesting it. He said he thought it was likely that Clifford would file something. He said the filing itself would cost money, time, and whatever remained of my father's public reputation in a town that had known the Castleton name for 50 years. He said the merits of the contest were, in his professional assessment, non-existent. He said this not unkindly, but in the flat, assured tone of a man who had read the same situation enough times to know how it ended. He said, "Your grandfather built this carefully, Luna. He built it so that the people who would try to tear it down would find nothing to grip." My grandfather died on a Tuesday morning in the second week of February. It was early, just past 5, and the sky outside was still the particular shade of dark that exists only in the hour before the light begins to change. I had been sleeping in the spare room down the hall since the first week of the month, when Darlene and I had both agreed without discussing it directly that someone should be there overnight. I woke because the concentrator had stopped its rhythm. It had not alarmed. It had simply stopped, the way a sound you have learned not to hear becomes suddenly, completely audible in its absence. I went to his room. His hand was already cooling when I took it. I sat beside the bed for a while. I did not cry right away. I sat in the dark and listened to the birch trees outside the window moving in whatever small wind was finding them, and I thought about a Sunday afternoon in October 2 years earlier when I had handed him a yellow-handled screwdriver and he had looked at it, turned it once in his fingers and said, "That's the one." As if finding the right tool was a small but serious matter that deserved acknowledgement. I had laughed. He had not laughed, but the corner of his mouth had moved in the way that was his version of laughing, which was enough. I called Darlene first. Then Victor. Then my father. My father picked up on the third ring, his voice thick with a sleep he had apparently been having without difficulty, and I told him. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "When?" I said, "Just now, a few minutes ago." He said he would make calls. I said okay. I hung up and sat back down beside the bed and held my grandfather's hand until the room got light. The funeral was 4 days later. They all came. My father in a dark coat that fit him the way expensive coats fit men who have recently lost weight they did not intend to lose. Renata with a grief that performed itself loudly in the parking lot and quieted noticeably once she was inside and seated. Doug stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the floor with the expression of a man attending an event he does not have the vocabulary for. Brittany came without her phone visible, which I noted, though I suspected it was in her bag on record. They stood at the front of the room near the casket and spoke to each other in low voices and did not speak to me unless I was within unavoidable proximity. I stood near the window with Victor Lund and an older woman named Patrice who had been in my grandfather's morning walking group for 12 years and who cried with the uncomplicated honesty of a person who was simply going to miss someone they loved. She told me he had walked every morning at 6 regardless of weather, never complained about anything more serious than the sidewalk on Garfield Avenue, and had once spent 20 minutes explaining the mechanics of a marine chronometer in a way that made her feel she understood something profound about time. I told her that sounded exactly right. She squeezed my arm and went to find her seat. Victor leaned over quietly and said the reading was scheduled for the following Friday. He said I should be prepared for the room to get loud. Victor Lund's conference room was on the third floor of a building on Cass Street that had been a savings and loan in a previous life and still had the original brass fixtures on the doors, the kind of detail that means either a building has been well maintained or nobody has gotten around to replacing things. There was no art on the walls. There were books and files and a Seth Thomas mantel clock on the credenza that I recognized from my grandfather's workshop repairs. I almost said something about it. I did not. My father arrived first. He came in with the contained energy of a man who has been preparing for a confrontation and is now having difficulty locating the appropriate moment to begin it. He sat at the far end of the table with his hands flat on the surface and looked at me when I came in with an expression that was trying to be neutral and was not succeeding. My mother sat beside him. She had driven up from the house they still shared in the technical sense, the sense in which two people occupy the same square footage without much else in common. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the drive. Renata and Doug came in together. Renata's jaw was set in the way it set when she had decided she was being wronged and was waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. Doug sat down and looked at the clock on the credenza with the polite blankness of a man who had decided the safest position in any room was no position at all. Brittany came in last, 3 minutes after everyone else, and sat at the corner of the table with her phone in her lap in a way that was clearly meant to look like her phone was not in her lap. Victor came in, closed the door, sat down and opened the dark green folder in front of him without preamble. He put on his reading glasses. He did not look at any of us. He read the preamble of the will in the steady, unhurried voice of a man reading a document that means exactly what it says and does not require interpretation. He read through the specific bequests, the workshop tools and all their contents to a vocational training program at the community college in Traverse City. The clocks in progress along with the inventory map to the program's instructor. A trail shelter my grandfather had quietly funded in 2019 was noted in a separate charitable bequest that nobody in the room had known about. Then Victor got to the primary estate. He read it the same way he read everything else, without theater, without pause for effect, without looking up. He said the house at Lighthouse Ridge Road, the investment accounts, the real property holdings in the Lower Peninsula, and all remaining personal assets, valued at net approximately $46 million after the distributed checks and charitable allocations, were left in their entirety to Luna Marie Castleton. He said there was a letter of intent authored and recorded by the testator, entered into the record and available to all parties. The room was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. I counted them. Then my father stood up. He did not shout. I want to be clear about that because the version my family later told people involved a great deal of shouting, and the actual version involved my father standing very still and speaking in the controlled, pressurized voice of a man trying to contain something too large for the container. He said, "Victor, I need you to explain to me how a legally competent person leaves $46 million to one grandchild and nothing to his own son." Victor said, "The will explains it." My father said, "I am asking you to explain it." Victor said, "The letter of intent explains it more specifically. I can play it now if you'd like." My father said he would like that very much. Victor pressed play on a small recorder on the table. My grandfather's voice came into the room and the air changed the way it does when someone who is no longer present suddenly is. His voice was the same as it had always been, measured and unhurried, with a slight Michigan flatness on certain vowels I had never noticed until I heard it in a room full of people straining to find fault with it. He spoke for 22 minutes. He described his reasoning clearly, specifically, and without malice. He described a pattern of behavior over 30 years. He described the Christmas dinner. He described the checks. He described, with the precision of a man who had been paying attention for a very long time, exactly what each person's response had told him about what each person valued. He described me last. He said I had come on Sundays for 5 years and never once asked about money. He said I had sat in the workshop, handed him screwdrivers, listened to weather reports on a radio that only picked up 2 stations, and had not once made him feel like a means to an end. He said, and his voice did not change, that this was not a small thing. He said it was, in his experience, a rarer thing than most people understood. When the recording ended, nobody spoke for a moment. Then Renata said, "He was not well when he made that." Victor said, "He was evaluated by his physician 11 days before that recording was made. The evaluation is in the file. Full capacity, no impairment, no suggestion of undue influence. Would you like a copy?" Renata looked at the table. My father said he would be contesting the will. He said it the way he announced most things, as if the announcement itself were a form of action. Victor said that was his right and that he had anticipated it and that the documents were structured accordingly. He said the capacity evaluations, the recorded statement, the witness affidavits, and the notarized letter of intent collectively represented one of the most thoroughly documented estates he had prepared in 30 years of practice. He said, "Clifford, you are welcome to contest it. I have been expecting it since 2019. I am ready." My father picked up his coat and left. My mother followed him. Doug followed Renata. Brittany looked at me once on her way out with an expression I could not fully read, and then she was gone. Victor sat back down. He folded his hands. He looked at me over his reading glasses and said, "How are you doing?" I said I was not entirely sure. He nodded as if that were the correct answer. He told me the contest would likely be filed within 30 days and resolved within 6 months given the documentation. He told me in the meantime the estate would be in a limited hold and that the $10 million check, having already cleared into my account in December per my grandfather's explicit pre-authorization, was fully mine and uncontestable. He said my grandfather had structured that specifically. He had wanted me to have something clean and unreachable before any of the rest of it began. The contest was filed 26 days later, naming undue influence and questioning testamentary capacity despite 3 physician evaluations saying otherwise, which told you more about the desperation of the filing than its merits. My father hired an attorney from Grand Rapids named Bellamy, who had a reputation for aggressive probate work, and sent letters to Victor in March that Victor described to me as optimistic. The hearing was set for late summer. I went back to my freelance work in my apartment on Front Street. I drove out to Lighthouse Ridge Road on Sundays out of a habit that had not yet learned it no longer had a destination, sitting in the driveway a few minutes before turning around and driving home. The hearing lasted 2 days. My grandfather's recorded voice was played again in a courtroom, and whatever my father's attorney had been planning to argue appeared to recalibrate itself somewhat upon hearing a 79-year-old man describe his own estate and his own reasoning with the calm specificity of someone who had anticipated every objection and addressed it in advance. The physician took the stand. Victor presented the evaluations. A neighbor named Carol, who had known my grandfather since 1987, testified that Gerald Castleton had been the most methodical person he had ever known and that suggesting otherwise was an embarrassment to the proceedings. The judge did not use the word embarrassment in her ruling, but her ruling said what it said, which was that the will was valid, the contest was dismissed, and that the petitioners would bear the legal costs. My father did not look at me when the ruling was read. He looked at the table the way he had looked at the torn check on Christmas Eve, with the expression of a man who has decided the outcome is everyone's fault but his own. My mother sat beside him and held her purse in her lap and looked at a point on the wall above the judge's head. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. I felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has been right about something for a long time and has finally been told officially that they were right, and found that being officially right is not as restorative as you imagined. I felt the absence of my grandfather in a room where his voice had been played twice and his wishes had been argued over by people who had not visited him in the last weeks of his life. I felt that more than anything else. Victor walked me out into the pale August light on Cass Street and said, "It's done." I said I knew. He said my grandfather would have found the whole proceeding mildly tedious but entirely predictable. I said that was probably accurate. He shook my hand and went back inside, and I stood on the sidewalk in the August heat and then walked to my car and sat in it and let myself cry for the first time since February, not because I had won but because it was over, and because the man who had made it possible was not there to hand me a screwdriver and tell me to stop making a thing of it. 2 years passed the way years pass after something large has happened to you, not quickly and not slowly, but with a kind of density, each month heavier than it looks from the outside. I am telling you this from a Sunday morning in October, at a kitchen table in a house I own outright on a bluff above Lake Michigan 40 minutes north of Traverse City, where the water in the morning looks like hammered pewter and the birch trees in the yard are ones I planted myself, small and crooked and entirely mine. I want to tell you what happened to everyone. Not because I think consequences are the point of this story, but because you have been here from the beginning and you deserve to know how things settled, the way you deserve to know the weather after you have sat through the storm. My father lost the hardware distribution company 8 months after the will contest was dismissed. He had been running it on thinning margins for 2 years, and the legal fees from the contest which the court had ordered him to bear were the last weight the structure could not hold. The warehouse on the south end of town was liquidated in the spring. A former employee named Dennis, who had worked the loading dock for 16 years, sent word through a mutual acquaintance that he hoped I was doing all right. I wrote back and said I hoped the same for him. I meant it more for Dennis than for the situation. My father is living now in a smaller house on the east side of town. He works part-time at a building supply store on the highway, the kind of work that would have been invisible to him 5 years ago and is now simply what he does. I do not know if he has made peace with any of it. I do not know because we have not spoken since the courthouse hallway in August of the year the case was decided, when he passed me on the way to the elevator and looked at me for a moment with an expression I have spent considerable time trying to name and still cannot, and then looked away and kept walking. I did not call after him. I have not called him since. I think about calling him sometimes, usually in the early morning when the lake is still and the house is quiet and there is enough space in the silence for difficult things to feel possible. I have not yet made the call. I'm not sure I will. I'm not sure I won't. Renata and Doug divorced in the 2nd year after the hearing. I found it out from Patrice, who mentioned it on the phone with the mild, unsurprised tone of a woman who has paid attention to the same town for 60 years. Renata had moved to a condo in Petoskey. Doug had stayed in the house with the 3-car garage and the magazine kitchen, which struck me as slightly poignant in the way all houses emptied of marriages are slightly poignant. I have not spoken to either of them. I do not expect to. Brittany lost a significant portion of her following in the year after the trial, not all at once but in the slow, unrecoverable way that audiences withdraw from someone they have decided is not who they thought. She had posted a series of videos vague enough to be deniable but specific enough that anyone who knew the situation understood what she was describing. Someone had left a comment with enough detail to shift the tone, and the thread had done what threads do, which is find the crack and pull. She deleted the videos. By then the damage was complete. She has a smaller platform now and has pivoted toward home organization content, which seems like a reasonable response to having spent several years making a mess. The Gerald Castleton Workshop Fund was established in March of the 1st year after the hearing. I worked with Victor to set it up properly, a dedicated endowment attached to the vocational training program at the community college that my grandfather had already named in his will. It funds tools, materials, and instructor stipends for the clock repair and mechanical restoration curriculum. There are currently 14 students enrolled in the program. 3 of them in the 1st year restored clocks that had come from my grandfather's unfinished inventory, the ones he had left notes inside. The instructor told me that when they opened the first one and found the note, a small white tag in my grandfather's careful print describing the original defect and the repair needed, the room had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something unexpected turns out to be meaningful. He said one of the students had asked if they could keep the note. The instructor had said yes. I was glad he had said yes. I kept the house on Lighthouse Ridge Road for 14 months after the estate was settled. I could not sell it and I could not yet fully inhabit it, so it existed in an in-between state that I think of now as the house waiting. Patrice checked on it twice a week. She watered the plants my grandfather had left on the sill and reported back on the state of the birch trees in the workshop and the cardinal that still came to the feeder in the yard, the same feeder my grandfather had filled every winter for 11 years. I asked her once how she knew it was the same cardinal. She said she didn't know for certain. She said it came at the same time each morning and took one seed and left, and that was enough for her. I thought about that for a long time. I sold the house in the 2nd spring to a couple from downstate who were retiring early and wanted land and quiet and a workshop they planned to use for woodworking. I walked through the rooms with them on the day of the closing, and the woman, whose name was June, stopped in the workshop doorway and looked at the benches and the shelves and the small white tags still attached to the empty hooks where the tools had been, and she said, "Someone did real work in here." I said yes. She said, "You can feel it." I said you could. I signed the papers that afternoon and drove away and did not look back at the birch trees, not because looking would have been wrong, but because I had already looked at them enough to carry them with me, which is the only way you ever really keep anything. The house I bought on the bluff north of town needed work when I moved in. The porch railing was soft in two places and the kitchen faucet had a slow drip that the previous owner had addressed by putting a cloth under it, which is not addressing it. I fixed the faucet myself with a YouTube video and a wrench I bought at the hardware store on Front Street, the one my father used to supply. I hired a carpenter named Roy for the porch railing. Roy was 63 years old and had been doing finish carpentry in the area for 35 years, and he worked with the same unhurried precision I recognized from my grandfather's workshop. That specific quality of attention a person develops when they have decided that doing a thing correctly is its own sufficient reason. We did not talk much while he worked. It was a comfortable silence. I made him coffee. He took it black. I do my design work at a long table by the window that faces the water. I have more clients now than I did when I was worried about money, which is the kind of irony that stops being ironic once you understand that the worry itself was the obstacle. I work in the mornings and walk in the afternoons on a trail that runs along the bluff above the water, and on clear days you can see the Manitou Islands sitting low on the horizon like a rumor of somewhere else. I planted the birch trees in the yard in April. They are thin and young and they will not look like much for years. That is fine. I did not plant them for now. There is a clock on the mantel in the living room. It is a Sessions shelf clock from the early 1900s, 8-day movement, original finish, a small crack in the case that I have decided is part of it rather than a flaw to correct. I found it at an estate sale in Elk Rapids on a Saturday morning in November, sitting on a folding table between a box of paperbacks and a ceramic rooster. Its hands stopped at 4:20. I picked it up and turned it over and looked at the back plate, and I knew immediately that I was going to buy it. I paid $12 for it. I brought it home and set it on the mantel and looked at it for a while. Then I went to the garage where I had stored the things from my grandfather's workshop that the college had not needed, the small tools, the spare parts trays, the particular set of watchmaker's screwdrivers with the yellow handles. I found the right one. I carried it inside. I sat down at the kitchen table and I opened the clock and I looked at the movement and I started, slowly and with no particular confidence, to figure out what it needed. I did not know exactly what I was doing. I knew I would learn. I turned the movement in the light and thought about what my grandfather had told me once on a Sunday afternoon when I had asked him how he always knew what was wrong with something before he had even taken it apart. He had looked at the clock on his bench for a moment and then looked at me and said, "You just have to be willing to sit with it long enough. Most people aren't patient enough to let it tell you." I set the movement down. I picked up the screwdriver. I began. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told, and here on Confire Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.